Hello and welcome to Brokenomics, and in this episode I'm extremely happy to have Peter St. Onge with me. Peter, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me on, Dan.
So, tell us a little bit about yourself, and why was it that you woke up one morning and decided that you were going to start debunking the official narrative?
I think I was born that way. I had gone to school for economics. My undergrad was in economics. I wanted to figure out how the world works. And I was in Canada, and it was a really crappy economy when I graduated. So I took whatever I could get, which happened to be a marketing job that based me out of Mexico and Brazil. And my degree was in economics. My mom was very disappointed. She said, "You have this impressive degree and you're going to do marketing?" But what was interesting for me is that while you're doing marketing, you're also modeling human behavior, right? You're trying to figure out why do people make decisions? Why do they do things? And the models, what struck me is that the models that we use in economics are very scientific looking. You know, they're these giant mathematical models, and often they bear no resemblance to reality. On the other hand, in marketing, they have almost no models. There's like a bunch of rules of thumb, like, yeah, if the customer hears about your thing 3 times, then they're going to buy it. I mean, it's very seat of the pants. But of course, bullshit walks in marketing, right? Like it's actually got to be accurate. If it's not accurate, then guess what? That rule of thumb goes away real fast. So that struck me, right? On the one hand, you have this extremely scientific, you have these people with giant brains who are, figuring out how the world works, but they're completely wrong.
Yes.
And then you got a couple of yahoos who disappoint their mom who actually do understand how people work. And we know this because they have beautiful houses and Lamborghinis and whatnot, right? So that to me was kind of a mystery. And I was goofing around with the stock market, so I put everything in the .com bubble and got out in time. So I retired at 25, and I was goofing around backpacking for a couple of years, which does get boring. That's a good lesson to learn young. And so I want to do something useful in life. And I sort of returned to the economics question. But I wanted to figure out economics as a field has an interesting goal, but it's apparently failing at it. And so looking around for alternatives really took me to Austrian economics. So specifically Murray Rothbard. And that for me, given I'd spent, a couple of years in marketing, sort of immersed in that world, and then before then in econ, that for me brought it together. And it was like, this is true economics, right? Like when you go through sort of the structure of Austrian economics, right? That, you have to have models of human behavior that are absolutely true, right? That are incontrovertible truths. First, you have to figure out what those are. And then once you've discovered those, and there's a very small number of them. What is it? Action has purpose. People differ, and work or leisure is a good thing. People like leisure. Okay, you take those 3 things, and astoundingly, you can spin off the entirety of economics, which for me, just absolutely blew my mind, right? Compared to mainstream economics, where they're
you were able
around,
to get. Yeah. You were able to get into Austrian economics in the academic environment, were you?
No, I browsed, I found Mark Skousen's book, The Making of Economics, in a bookstore in Tokyo. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of Austrian economics. So through my entire undergrad program in Canada, I'd never heard the name Rothbard, Mises. Growing up, I'd never ever heard. I've been, interested in economics forever. I used to read The Economist back when it was not a left-wing rag. And I'd never come across any of these people at all. Yeah. It was just some random bookstore, and I saw, who is this, Mises guy?
I can totally sympathise with that, because, I went and did an economics undergraduate degree, and the reason I did it is because I was interested in economics. And that degree kind of basically killed my interest in economics for a while, because all they wanted to do was ram Keynesianism down your throat. Now, to be fair, they were probably doing the right thing, because if you want to use an economics degree and get a job, it better be Keynesian, because otherwise you're not getting hired by certainly any government authority. But it was after that, and you start to get into it, and then economics comes back to life again.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and I think that's a big reason why Austrian is taking off. Is that what we call academic economics? It's like a goal-seeking. It's almost like some secret handshake you do to like get in with the in crowd. It has nothing to do with how the actual world works, how
Yeah.
human societies work, what kind of lessons you can get from history. And so, there are a lot of people in this world who are very, very interested in those topics. And when they try to go to economics to answer them, they get crap answers. And so they start looking on their own. And,
Yeah.
nowadays, of course, it's a lot easier to find Austrian economics than it was in the
Well,
1990s.
the Keynesians, they try and turn everything into an equation, but it's just not, and the equations don't work. And it's evident. I think the Fed employs, whatever it is, like 19,000 economists.
Yeah.
But evidently the results they're getting is wrong. So I'll tell you what. Let's start with my first question for you, and I think as an Austrian economist, you'll get this one right straight away. But I've got two dictionaries, one written in the 80s and one written in the 2000s.
For sure.
The one written in the 80s tells me that inflation is an expansion of the monetary supply, and the one written in the 2000s tells me that it's prices going up. So which is true?
Right. So you've got the symptom and you've got the cause, right? So the cause of inflation is printing money. And then the symptom, the part that you can see of it, is that the prices go up. And so if your goal is to hide why it's happening, then obviously you run with the symptom. And I mean, of course, this describes the entirety of Keynesian economics. They don't just hide it with the symptoms. They hide it a number of ways. One of them is the equations we just got done talking about, right? They try to obscure what's happening because it is fundamentally a psychological op. It is not seeking the truth. It is not actually trying to fix problems in the world. It is trying to hide. It is a scientific or it's propaganda masquerading as a scientific field.
Because, I mean, let's take the recent actions of the Fed. They've got an inflation problem, which apparently has absolutely nothing to do with them printing all of that money. And their response to that is, okay, let's try and take away everybody's job and crush all the small businesses. Now, if it's that second definition, I can sort of see how that might make sense, because if inflation is wages go up, prices go up, wages go up, prices going up, you can kind of see how stamping on the head of the economy until it doesn't move anymore works.
Yeah.
But if it's that other definition, where it's the printing of the money that causes inflation, well, you can stamp on the economy all you like. It's not going to make the slightest amount of difference to the amount of money you printed 2 years ago.
Yeah, it'll make some difference just because of the fractional reserve system, right? So commercial banks take the money they print and then they spin that up. In the US anyway, they spin up about $3 extra for every one. So it's like every bank in America, in the world, has like a little in-house money printer that they can run. So, I mean, to a certain degree, if the Fed crushes the private economy, then yes, it can cause loans to be defaulted and it can basically.
But it's kind of like mowing your lawn with napalm, though.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like the simplest way to fix it would just be that the Fed would make that uncomfortable phone call to their bosses over in the White House, and they would say, "No more. We're not buying your garbage anymore. You need to control yourself. You have a problem. You're an addict." All right, and then if the federal spending would come in, so that the Fed wouldn't have to help them create all this money, then the private economy could just keep chugging along. The rest of us could keep our jobs. We could keep our businesses. But instead, of course, the Fed knows who pays their bills. They know who the boss is. They're never going to do that. There was actually a congressional hearing a couple months ago where there was a senator who asked Jerome Powell, the Fed chief, he asked him whether federal spending was part of the problem. Okay, is this part of what's driving inflation? Obviously it is. Every school of economics knows that. But anyway, Jerome Powell had this attitude like you had just insulted his wife. I mean, he was really, really uncomfortable. He was like, "Wow, no, we don't talk about such things." I mean, the Fed masquerades as this public service. Of course, same with the Bank of England. They masquerade as some public service as if they're, like the water company or something. No, they are absolute political creatures. Their job is propaganda to cover up the crimes, the financial crimes of the state.
Well, what they are is they're central planners. And we kind of, as a society, we understand that we don't want central planning in the bread supply, in the autumn, in the tractor supply. But for some reason, we accept central planning in the money, which then is kind of, by proxy, it is sort of central planning for everything else by extension.
Oh yeah, absolutely it is. Everything else runs off the money. the way that they centrally plan the money is by, flooding it out, which causes inflation. They also do it via the interest rate. Those two things together control the entirety of the economy. They determine which industries get money, which individuals get money. So it is controlling the money, controlling the interest, far more important than controlling the bread, even. But because they have the equations and they have the symptoms and they have all of 19,000 economists over at the Fed, untold tens of thousands in universities. These are all kept women saying what they're paid to say. They've got this entire propaganda army that is trying to convince people that their central planning, their screwing up the world, is actually necessary.
So let me ask you a slightly harder question then, because you mentioned there that the central bankers, they know who they work for. They know they work for the politicians.
Right.
Who do the politicians work for?
That is the trick. And, one of the things that a lot of people talk about is the change in government architecture. Okay, this might seem random, right? But, if you look at government buildings today, they're horrifically ugly. And then you look at buildings, this is especially true in Britain, right? You look at buildings from 100 years ago, and they're absolute masterpieces. And you might ask, what changed? I mean, it's weird. Like, are people dumber now? They may be dumber. But,
possible.
It's always possible. But, private homes have not undergone that same transformation into, horrific eyesores. And so what I think happened there is that governments in the 19th century actually did care about what voters wanted. Okay, they were trying to appeal to people. If you were, building a train station in 1894 and you built a really ugly one, you were going to get in trouble. The people were going to be like, "What is this? Explain yourself." You'd probably get fired because you would embarrass a bunch of people along the chain because the population at large would be upset about it. Today, they act like they don't care anymore. And I think what changed is that the progressive era in both Britain and the US, really across the world, the progressive era created this government that can survive whether or not the people are on board. Okay, they can control the schools, which means that they can indoctrinate the next generation. They have enormous control over the media. They more or less tell the media what to print. I mean, in Britain, that's obviously true directly.
Yes.
And so at that point, they are insulated from the people. So they can build any old crap they want, and they don't particularly care whether the people like it or not. They are playing to their own audience.
It feels very much to me that there was a time, not necessarily that long ago, where the politicians were trying to solve the problems of the public, whereas now it feels like that they are trying to solve the problem of the public. Modern politics has essentially become livestock management. And then they're always trying to control us and jostle us and steer us.
Yeah, I've been chastised by Congress people for talking about the crap they do, and they say, I'm getting calls from my constituents. I said, that's your job. You're supposed to listen to that. Thank me for putting your constituents in touch with you so that you can learn what you're supposed to be doing. I mean, honestly, politicians act like the people are an annoyance.
Yes. So, look, if you are an American who likes the idea of low taxes and a small state, sensible government spending, how do you achieve that at the ballot box?
There's a lot of different techniques. The most effective, I think, is number one, starve the beast. So you have to, first cut off tax revenue, reduce that as much as possible. That's usually a pretty easy sell because most people don't like paying taxes. Of course, the problem is that at that point, the government's going to turn to the next one, which is the debt and the money printing. So, you have to close that off as well. So, limitations on the debt. Obviously, getting rid of the central bank is enormously helpful. Especially during COVID, the central bank really let governments worldwide get away with things that they never even dreamed of. If you sort of imagine for a moment, this would be true in the US or UK. If you imagine early in COVID, you had a bunch of ministers sitting around talking about doing these COVID lockdowns. And imagine that you're some junior guy and you show up and you say, hey, I got an idea. We're going to shut down the entire country, right? We're going to throw, half of people out of work. Tax revenue will also collapse by half, but that's fine because we won't need as many government workers, so we can just lay them all off, right? So, good luck with that one, right? Wouldn't have worked. They would have said, "You're insane. That's impossible. You would be demoted. You'd be shipped out to, a job that your mom would be really embarrassed
speaking of
about."
lockdowns, and that whole sort of 2020 and 2021 period,
Yeah.
where are you on cock up or conspiracy?
It's an interesting question. I think it was initially I think it was a cock up, but I think that like all cock ups, it attracts opportunists who saw a way to grab power. I think honestly, they never imagined that it would succeed anywhere near to what it did. At the time, I remember I was writing out of Quebec, and they had a new rule that construction workers and truck drivers had to stay home. And, of course, I made the point that construction, this is something you do outside. And so maybe they could do that. And, of course, truck driving, you're alone. And, so I wrote something up that said, sort of took the blue collar perspective and said, look, this is fine for the keyboard warriors who can telecommute, but, there are a lot of guys who can't do that. Yeah, exactly. And the government in Quebec at the time was left populist. Okay, so kind of like Bernie Sanders, I guess. And he actually flipped around based on that. And I thought, my God, it works. You can't actually correct errors. So he actually flipped around and he said, okay, no, fair enough. We're going to loosen things up on drivers and construction workers. And so, I had a drink that night, and then I come in the next day, and the media had gone ballistic. You are murdering grandmother. You have blood on your hands, you barbarian. And so they flipped around again, and now they made it even stricter. So that, for me, was a lesson that, I think there's this sort of interaction where the government seeks power. That power creates opportunists. It creates lobbyists. Those lobbyists channel money to either media or university. There's this sort of interaction. And if any part of that, stops playing along, even if the government, which in theory is in charge of the whole thing, if they stop playing along, the other parts will punish them. So it's like they're all locked in this embrace going down the drain, because all of their incentives are linked with all of the other ones playing their part. And so I think that the only way that we can possibly fix that is that we have to go to the root of it. We have to cut off the tax revenue, cut off the borrowing, cut off the central banking. That alone, right, to bring us to a world where, the government actually has to fire workers. It actually has to fire these regulators who sit around dreaming up new ways to crush businesses.
And is that achievable? Yeah. Because, you're talking about these incentive structures that reinforce and they keep on playing back on themselves. And the flip side of that on the debt side of things is that I presumably you would agree that we were in a debt spiral. So is it possible to pull out of that? And how could that actually be done? Or is it the case that we basically need to have a messy crash in order to come to our senses, to start to think, well, actually, no, this isn't going to work?
Yeah, I think you can definitely pull out of it. And I think you're correct that, in any kind of unsustainable fiscal situation, there's the easy way and the hard way, right? The easy way is to fix it. The hard way is that you're going to have a crash and you're going to fix it anyway. So maybe just fix it ahead of time. I think that you can definitely fix it. We had an opportunity in the U.S. Just about 2 weeks ago with the debt ceiling, right? And what was going to happen on that if they hadn't come to an agreement, if the Uniparty had not flexed its muscles, then we would have had a balanced budget immediately, right?
One of the things I keep hearing coming up in the US Discord is, what do they call it? A balanced budget bill. Yeah. Well, just don't pass the debt ceiling. It's the same thing.
For sure. Yeah, right. I was completely advocating that. I said, just let the darn thing hit. The U.S. government, the federal government spends about $6.2 trillion a year. Out of that, they collect about 4.8 in taxes, and then the other 1.4 is borrowed. If the debt ceiling hit, the media and the government were spinning it as if, everything would collapse, right? The financial markets, we'd all, grandma would be eating cat food. There'd be no school lunches for the children. And, this is always kind of the fear game they play. But fundamentally, if that ceiling had hit, all it means is that the U.S. would have to reduce 1.4 trillion in spending, which is 22%. Now, that's a hunk of change, but, anybody who's ever run a business, if you run into hard times and you have to cut 22% of your costs, it can always be done, right? And you prioritize the things that are most important. Let's say the pensions, the veteran benefits, school lunches, water inspection. Biden literally threatened. He indirectly threatened. He said, if we don't pass the debt ceiling, we may not be able to pay the water inspectors. I mean, it is.
We start there, don't you? You start with the water inspectors, the firemen, the national parks, but the defence contractors, they're going to be safe.
Right. That's exactly it. I mean, it is really shameful, the game they play. But if our government were run, well, let me put it this way: if voters held the government accountable, which media has a big part to play in that, right? Media actually has to not get in the way and not propagate government stories. But if voters demanded that politicians actually do their job, then it would be very easy to cut 22%. My gosh, you could probably cut 60, 80%.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound as bad actually. It doesn't sound as bad as it is here. I mean, I've run the numbers here. I mean, I didn't calculate it just to balance the budget. I calculated it to balance the budget and to pay down the existing debt over a 20-year period. Now, in order to do that, we need to cut spending here in the UK by about a third. But actually, because of the big departments, they've got a lot of non-cash items in. There's a lot of depreciation and stuff like that. Effectively, you're cutting the operating budget of everything by about 50% in order to sort of get back to a sort of sane position. So I imagine it might be a little bit higher, even in the US, than that sort of 22%. But if you were to do that, I mean, how would you do it? Because a lot of people on the right, they always talk about Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid as being just unsustainable. So if you were to take an axe to government spending in the US, I mean, how would you do it? And would you be able to leave those programs alone, especially considering the growth that we've got with the demographics coming?
Yeah, and here I'm speaking personally. I'm not speaking on behalf of any of the organizations I work with. But, personally, I think that, of course, the defense budget can be cut massively. I don't want America to be able to fight wars overseas. I want us to be able to defend our country, as every country should. Next up, and I suspect this is true in Britain as well, but most of the money that goes to welfare and social aid, it is for people who are more or less able-bodied. There are indeed people who genuinely need help. They cannot care for themselves. That is a relatively small number. And, at least in the US, you have a lot of people who they go on government benefits because they're relatively attractive. When I was a college student, I was, of course, on government benefits because, I had a low official income. So I was a college student. I was headed towards the upper middle class. It does not seem fair that I was forcing other people to wake up and, leave, head off at 5 a.m. to go to work so that they can pay taxes so that I can, sit around and drink beer. But I think if the government actually had to face hard choices, rather than just spending whatever it likes, then they would actually be forced to sit down and go through and say, okay, well, people who are whatever in their 70s and not in good health, obviously they need to be taken care of. People who are completely, I don't know.
Yeah, because there is a bit of a demographic challenge as well with the boomer generation. It's a large generation, and they're just now getting to the point where they become quite expensive. And this would be the case for your Medicare and Medicaid program. It's very much the case with our NHS program. The issue that we've got is they've got a large debt problem, and realistically, they're not going to cut spending. They're going to try and do it through inflating the debt away. The problem you've got with the NHS and your Medicare and Medicaid programs is that those are not dollar values that you can inflate away. It is provision of medical goods and services. It's doctors' time. It's a hell of a lot harder to inflate that away.
Yeah, in fact, at least in the US, those go up substantially higher than inflation. And so inflation could actually make the problem worse. The US, of course, has a uniquely bad medical system. It's very good in some ways. Waiting times, it's excellent. The quality of service is exceptional. Dictators all over the world fly to the US, I'm proud to say, for their treatment. It is exceptionally good. However, it is also astoundingly expensive. And, a big part of this is that there is so much corrupt lobbying within medical policy that, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, just across the board, they all get what they want. And it ends up, it's not actually being paid by the patient, right? So, typical might be you go to the hospital. Yeah, right. So, I might incur a $20,000 bill at the hospital, but I don't actually pay any of it. I mean, of course I do, but it's paid indirectly. And so there's relatively little social pressure to change any of that. But if you were trying to get us on a, I think honestly, just reducing the military and sort of trimming the benefit system down to people who genuinely need it, I think you could get it that way. But in addition,
and maybe a few of the pork barrel programs and the activists and some of the other more questionable stuff would probably have to go.
That's another great point, right? There are probably hundreds of billions in the U.S. that go to fund activists. We had a bunch of riots. I think you guys did too, a couple years ago. And every so often, they would post their mugshots in the newspaper, and they might give, you could look up what these people do for a living. And almost to a man, they worked for some kind of a non-government, an NGO, a nonprofit, some organization like that. And then if you go and look at the NGOs, where do they get their money? Almost all of it is from the government. In other words, your government, at least in the case of the U.S., the federal government is paying an army of rioters to destroy cities in order to achieve socialist ends that lead to a bigger government. They do know what they're doing.
Yeah, entirely. So you mentioned cutting military spending. The US has been remarkably unlucky that it's found itself at war basically all the time. The only thing I would say is that they have been, on the other hand, fairly lucky that the people that have declared war on the US and they need to start bombing have just so happened to also be the people who are considering moving away from the dollar. So I suppose there's swings and roundabouts on that one. And the other thing that strikes me is incredibly lucky for them is the people they're up against at the moment, of course, the Russians. The Russians seems to be attacking themselves more than anyone else. They're blowing up their own bridges and dams and pipelines. So, but the US is extremely militaristic. Now, is that a feature of the dollar status being the reserve currency? Was there something else going on there?
It's an interesting question. I think it is a consequence. The dollar's status in the world, I don't think is that tied to the military stuff. I do think they're separate. There is an enormous lobbying organization in the U.S. There, of course, if you've got an $800 billion military budget, that's going to pay a whole lot of lobbyists, and they have an enormous amount of pull. I think that they do tend to look at the dollar separately. The dollar took over as world currency mainly because the UK shot itself in the foot. But at which point, the dollar was gold backed. The government was at that point relatively small. This is before, before World War II anyway. So it was a much smaller government. And so it sort of won on the merits. And then since then, the U.S. has seemed to get interested in countries when they threaten to get off the dollar, such as Libya. I think what's unclear is whether, did the U.S. topple Gaddafi specifically because he was threatening to get off the dollar? At the time, he was talking about gold backing the currency there. So what's unclear to me is, did they do that because he was doing that? Or did they do that just because the military-industrial complex is extremely entrepreneurial and it would look for any excuse whatsoever to invade a country? And basically Gaddafi volunteered.
What do you make of what RFK, Robert Kennedy Jr. has been saying about because he's very off script with this, and he basically says that the CIA is an organization that feeds the top of the funnel of the US war machine. It supplies a constant supply of new wars for the military industrial complex to get theirs. Does that chime with you at all?
Yeah, well, we've been warning about that, I think, for a long time. And, not just people who are off script. Eisenhower warned, very clearly that if you create this military-industrial complex, it will take you over. Eisenhower is, he's on script, pretty much as on script as can be. And I think that absolutely there is this massively entrepreneurial organization made up of intelligence agencies, of the military itself, and it is constantly seeking out wars. It is, they have a list. There's 200 candidates in the world, 200 countries, and they go through and literally they have. It's like a company coming up with a new product every year. You say, "Do you think this will sell?" I don't know.
Yeah.
they just go right through the list. And I think CIA is absolutely part of that. They have a hand in, I don't know exactly what they do. Apparently it's all classified. We have, it was just reported, we have 1 billion classified documents in the US government. So it would be really entertaining to know what those things are, since allegedly the people are sovereign over the republic. But at any rate, yes, I mean, I have no doubt there is an entire industry that manufactures wars in this country.
And what do you, I mean, while we're on RFK, I mean, what do you make of the options that you Americans are going to have coming up? I mean, RFK seems viable on the Democratic side, although he's never going to be allowed anywhere near it. And then you've got, maybe Trump and DeSantis. I mean, what are you seeing amongst those guys? Anything you like there?
Yeah, so the shorthand on RFK is that he's going to be Bernied, right? Meaning that they'll do to him what they did to Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders had enormous popularity, especially among the young, and the sort of Democrat machine played all kinds of dirty tricks. They basically treated him like they normally treat a Republican to try to cripple him and to get him out. So I for sure they're going to try to do that to RFK. The Republican side is, I think, a lot more unknown. I think in DeSantis and Trump, there are two candidates who are widely popular among Republican voters. Both of them are very much anti-establishment. If it were the Democrat Party, of course, they would have choked them both off. But at this point, the Republican Party is in such shambles that the establishment Republicans really don't count for anything anymore. And so there's, I think 7 or something establishment candidates floating around. None of them are getting any kind of traction. So I would imagine that the establishment is going to be successful in chasing RFK out, unfortunately. And, it really comes down to, in my mind, 50-50 between DeSantis and Trump, which means that you do get a choice. And then at that point, we see how clean the elections are.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? Because, I mean, you talked about being Bernied, and we know that Democrat primaries are, heavily fortified. But you might level the same charge at general elections these days. I mean, especially since
for sure.
The only people who actually received any punishment for the fortification of 2020 were the people who objected to it. They're still in solitary confinement.
Yes, so they are.
I have to wonder, will we ever see an unfortified election in the US again, now that they know that they can get away with it?
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.